My name is Daniel Mercer, and I never expected to inherit anything more than a collection of old paperbacks or a dented thermos. Yet, when the letter from a solicitor's office arrived, typed on stiff cream stationery, it announced that my late uncle had left me his cabin in British Columbia. I had not spoken to him in nearly a decade. The news felt like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of confusion and unease spreading outward, because my uncle was a man who had severed ties with the family years ago, retreating into the forests as though the world itself offended him. I remember the way he looked when I was a child, visiting him once during a strained holiday trip, tall, bearded, with eyes that never seemed to blink often enough. His name was Richard Mercer, though most people in the surrounding logging town called him Doc. Not because he was a doctor, but because he collected field guides and survival manuals the way other men collected beer cans. When he died, there was no funeral, only a simple note in the solicitor's packet that said his remains had been handled according to his wishes. That phrase chilled me more than grief ever could. Still, curiosity is a stronger current than comfort, and so I packed my truck with the bare essentials: sleeping bag, canned food, a flashlight, and drove north until the highways thinned into roads edged with moss and fir. Each mile carried me further from reception bars on my phone, until it finally gave up trying to find a signal. By the time I reached the turnoff the letter described, I felt as though I had already stepped into another century. The cabin appeared without ceremony, a squat silhouette at the end of a narrow dirt path, its roof crowned with green shingles slick from rain. Mist curled in the trees behind it, as though the forest itself exhaled to greet me. For a long while, I sat in the truck and listened to the engine tick as it cooled. The world felt unnaturally hushed, like a place where voices were unwelcome. I carried my bag inside. The cabin smelled of pine, mildew, and something faintly metallic, as though old blood had once been wiped from the wooden planks. The main room contained a wood stove, a rough, hewn table, and shelves crowded with jars filled with preserved mushrooms, roots, and things I could not identify. Against one wall was a narrow bed covered in a wool blanket that looked older than I was. It was on that bed where I found the envelope. My name was written across the front in my uncle's sharp, cramped hand. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. The first was a short note: Daniel, if you're reading this, then the cabin is yours. Do not treat this as a gift. Treat it as a burden to be managed. The woods do not forgive neglect. The second sheet contained a list. At first glance it looked absurd, like the kind of half-mad ramblings one expects from an eccentric bachelor who spent too many years alone. Yet the longer I stared, the less I wanted to laugh. The rules were numbered, written with deliberate care. They read: 1. Always lock the door after dark, even if you leave only for a moment. Do not whistle after sunset. They hear it, and they like to follow. 3. If the wind dies suddenly, go inside at once. Bolt the shutters. Wait until you hear birdsong again. Never fish from the dock past midnight. The water does not belong to us then. 5. If you hear scratching on the roof, do not investigate. Light the lantern and stay in bed until morning. 6. Should you see a figure in the tree line waving, do not wave back, no matter how familiar they seem. 7. Offer a piece of bread at the edge of the clearing each dawn. Leave it on the stump. Do not look to see what takes it. The paper trembled in my hands. Some part of me wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, rural superstition, the fevered product of isolation. But the ink was too steady, the lines too confident. My uncle had not written these rules for amusement. He had written them as instructions. I folded the list carefully and slid it into my jacket pocket, telling myself it was out of respect for the dead. Yet in truth, it was because I felt I might need to read it again. That first evening, Rain swept in with the kind of suddenness only mountain weather can conjure. The roof rattled beneath the downpour, and the windows blurred with streaks of water. I lit the lantern, remembering the advice about darkness, though the sky had not fully lost its light. Shadows grew thick in the corners of the cabin. Every creak of timber sounded amplified, as though the structure strained against invisible pressure. I forced myself to eat a can of beans at the table, trying to conjure ordinary comfort. But my gaze kept returning to the note and its strange commandments. I found myself checking the door twice, testing the lock with a nervous twist. I avoided whistling, though the habit sometimes came unbidden when I was anxious. And when the rain paused abruptly, leaving the air still as a held breath, my stomach lurched. Birdsong did not return for nearly 20 minutes. In that silence, I swore I heard movement beyond the shutters, the soft pad of something large circling, the faint scrape of claws on wood. When the sparrows finally chattered again, I realized my hands ached from gripping the lantern too tightly. Sleep that night was shallow. I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams, every groan of the cabin setting my nerves on edge. Sometime past midnight, a new sound joined them, faint scratching directly above me, deliberate and slow, like nails tracing circles on the shingles. My breath caught. The rule about the roof returned vividly. Do not investigate. Light the lantern. Stay in bed. I fumbled for the matchbox with trembling fingers, struck a flame, and lifted the lantern until its glow filled the room. The scratching paused. The silence that followed was somehow worse, because it left me waiting for the sound to resume. Minutes passed like hours. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me into sleep, though unease coiled tightly in my chest. Morning light revealed nothing unusual. No marks on the roof, no footprints in the damp soil outside. The only anomaly was the bread I left on the stump, as the rule demanded. I tore a slice from the loaf I had bought in town and placed it there, feeling absurd. Yet when I returned hours later, it was gone. Not crumbled, not dragged into the brush. Simply absent, as though lifted cleanly away. Days passed in that rhythm, each one eroding my skepticism. The silence in the woods grew uncanny, punctuated by sudden gusts that carried whispers too low to decipher. At dusk, I often felt eyes watching me from the trees, though I never saw anyone. One evening, while chopping wood, I glimpsed a shape between the fir trunks, a figure, tall and indistinct, waving slowly. My chest seized. The face was hidden by distance, but the gesture was unmistakable. Against every instinct, my arm twitched to rise in reply. I dropped the axe instead, stumbling back into the cabin, slamming the door. Through the narrow slit of the shutter, I watched the figure linger for what felt like an eternity before melting back into the forest. That night I dreamed of my uncle. He stood at the foot of the bed, his beard dripping with rainwater, his eyes glassy. His voice was hollow when he said, "You cannot leave now. You agreed to the rules." I woke with the taste of soil in my mouth. The longer I stayed, the more the cabin began to feel less like shelter and more like a trap constructed from tradition and fear. Yet each time I thought about leaving, I remembered the solicitor's letter. Do not treat this as a gift. Treat it as a burden to be managed. The words implied permanence, as though departure was not an option. And then came the night when the scratching on the roof did not stop. It began at dusk, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent, as though something circled above, testing the barrier between us. I lit the lantern as instructed, but the sound continued. Scrapes, thuds, the shiver of shingles. My heart pounded so violently that I thought it might draw attention, a beacon of panic. Hours passed. My eyelids drooped despite terror. I might have slept briefly, but I woke to silence so deep it roared in my ears. The lantern's flame sputtered low, casting weak light across the cabin. Then came the knock. not on the roof, but on the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze. The rules said nothing about knocking. The knocks echoed through the cabin, a dull rhythm that seemed to sink into the wood itself. I sat rigid on the bed, clutching the lantern so hard that the hot glass threatened to blister my palm. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. Whoever, or whatever, stood on the porch was patient. It did not pound like someone desperate for shelter. It tapped as though announcing itself, waiting politely for an invitation. The rules did not cover this. I unfolded the list again, scanning the lines until my eyes blurred. Lock the door. Do not whistle. Stay inside when the wind dies. Nothing about knocks, nothing about doors. My mind raced with the possibility that this was some trick. Another lure. Like the figure waving at the tree line. If they wanted me to open the door, then opening it must be the worst thing I could do. I stayed seated, barely breathing. The knocking continued, unchanging, until the lantern sputtered. As the flame dwindled, I panicked and struck another match, feeding the wick until the glow flared back. Only then did the knocking cease. Silence returned, but it was a silence swollen with presence, as though someone lingered just beyond the threshold, ear pressed against the wood. I did not sleep at all. I waited until dawn's gray light seeped through the shutters before I dared to move. When I finally cracked the door, nothing stood outside. The porch was slick with dew, the clearing empty. The bread I had left on the stump the previous morning was gone, as usual, but a small mark remained in the soil beside it. A print, wide and deep, with too many toes to belong to a man. By then, I understood that the rules were not eccentricities. They were survival. The days blurred. I tried to build a routine, chopping wood, boiling water, cleaning the shelves of jars I refused to open. Each morning, I laid bread on the stump. Each evening, I lit the lantern before night fell, making sure the lock was firm. Even so, disturbances grew bolder. Some nights I heard the scrape of nails beneath the floorboards. Others, the windows rattled though no wind blew. I felt observed in every moment, and the rules became not just rituals but prayers. One afternoon, while exploring the edge of the property, I discovered a trapdoor beneath a layer of pine needles. The handle was rusted but solid. When I tugged, it lifted to reveal a narrow stair descending into darkness. The air that rose from below smelled of earth and iron like a tomb. I nearly descended, lantern in hand, but the rules echoed in my skull. The woods do not forgive neglect. My uncle had never mentioned a cellar. Perhaps there was a reason. I shut the trapdoor and covered it again. That night, I dreamed of my uncle once more. He stood in the same spot at the foot of my bed, but this time his voice was urgent. Do not feed them more than bread. Do not speak their names. Do not break the circle. His words rattled me awake, heart hammering. The rules had not mentioned any circle. I wondered if he had meant the daily ritual itself, or if another set of instructions existed, hidden somewhere in the cabin. I searched the next day, pulling books from shelves, checking beneath the bed, rifling through drawers. Among the papers, I found a journal bound in leather, its pages crowded with cramped writing. Most of it was mundane, observations of weather, lists of supplies, but occasionally entire paragraphs were blacked out, ink slashed so furiously that the paper tore. Still, fragments remained. They come when the moon wanes, and their eyes are not eyes, but mirrors. And once, near the end, if I fail to leave the offering, they will enter. I do not know what happens after that, and I will not allow myself to learn. Reading it left me cold. I placed the journal back and swore not to touch it again, though the words seared themselves into memory. 2 weeks into my stay, I tried leaving the cabin for more than a day. I wanted to return to town, to call someone, to shake the weight of this isolation. But when I packed my bag and started the truck, The engine coughed once, twice, then died. I checked the tank half full. I checked the battery fine. Yet no matter what I tried, the machine refused to catch. I walked down the dirt road for hours, hoping to find reception. But the further I went, the more the forest thickened, twisting the path until I realized I had circled back near the cabin. The place did not want me to leave. That night, something pressed against the shutters. Not a knock this time, but the unmistakable sound of breath-fogging glass. I sat in the dark, too afraid to light the lantern, until the shape shifted away. The list of rules had saved me before. Maybe following them was the only reason I still lived. Yet a new terror grew. What if the list was incomplete? What if the rules changed? The bread offerings grew more disturbing. At first, the slice simply vanished. Then, one morning, I found crumbs arranged in a perfect circle on the stump. Another time, the bread was returned charred black, though no fire had burned nearby. Once, I awoke to find the loaf inside the cabin, resting neatly on the table, though I had locked the door. My resolve began to crack. I spoke aloud to the empty air, demanding answers, demanding release. In those moments, I imagined I heard whispers rising from the trees, like laughter woven with words I could not understand. Then, during the third week, I broke a rule. It was not deliberate. I had been chopping wood near dusk, lost in the rhythm of the axe, when a tune surfaced in my mind. Without thinking, I whistled. Just 3 notes. The sound hung in the cooling air, sharp as glass. I froze, blood turning to ice. The rules had been clear: do not whistle after sunset. The forest hushed. No wind, no insects, no birds. My own pulse thundered in my ears. From the trees, something stirred. Branches shifted, though no breeze moved them. I glimpsed pale faces among the trunks. Too many, too tall, each featureless except for black hollows where eyes should be. They swayed as though in unison, moving closer. I dropped the axe and fled into the cabin, slamming the door and locking it with fumbling hands. The figures did not follow across the clearing. Instead, they gathered at the tree line watching. Even after I lit the lantern, their silhouettes remained. Only when dawn broke did they vanish like mist. The next morning, the bread was gone before I set it down. Something snatched it from my hand as I placed it on the stump, unseen fingers brushing mine. I yanked my hand back and nearly screamed. The rules had protected me, but once broken, I felt they marked me differently. In the days that followed, I wrote my own addition to the list. Do not forget the weight of silence. Do not tempt it with song. Still, the knocking returned. Always 3 slow knocks, patient, polite. I never answered. But I began to wonder if I ignored it long enough, would they find another way in? That answer arrived sooner than expected. One night, as rain hammered the roof, I heard the knocks again. This time not at the door but at the window. I had bolted the shutters, yet the sound came all the same, knuckles on wood. Then at the second window, then the third. The cabin reverberated with the rhythm, surrounding me, closing in. My lantern flame guttered, shadows leaping like predators. In desperation, I cried out for my uncle, though I knew he was long dead. For the first time, the knocking stopped. Silence fell. In that silence, a voice answered. It came from just beyond the window, muffled but clear, my uncle's voice, saying my name. When I first heard my uncle's voice, calling from beyond the shuttered window, I thought exhaustion had finally broken something in my mind. Yet the tone was too precise, too deliberate, matching exactly the cadence I remembered from childhood. "Daniel," it said again, low and even, like a man trying to coax a frightened animal. I felt my body lock, every muscle screaming that this was a lure. The rules had warned me against figures waving, against things pretending familiarity. But this was more intimate than a gesture. It was speech. My uncle had never warned about voices, yet instinct told me the same principle applied. If they wanted me to respond, I must not. So I sat in silence, gripping the lantern as though it were an anchor. The voice persisted, repeating my name with faint variations, softer, angrier, patient, commanding. Minutes stretched into hours. At some point I realized tears streamed down my face, though I hadn't noticed myself crying. When dawn lightened the edges of the shutters, the voice faded. I staggered into uneasy sleep on the bed, shoes still on, lantern guttering at my side. When I woke, the air inside the cabin felt fouled, heavy with something that clung to my throat. I checked outside. The bread on the stump was untouched, though around it the soil was torn into claw-like grooves, circling as if something had paced angrily all night. I replaced the offering, and for the first time I whispered as I set it down, "Take it and leave me." My words carried no authority, but they eased the tremor in my hands. When I looked back an hour later, the bread was gone. The grooves in the dirt, however, remained, a scar carved into the clearing. By then, I no longer thought of leaving. The truck's dead engine, the looping road, the way the forest folded space, all of it convinced me escape was impossible. I had become caretaker of the rules, bound as my uncle had been. Yet the more I obeyed, the more the boundaries tightened. The bread disappeared faster, the whispers came nearer, the nights grew longer. I began to dream not just of my uncle, but of others. A child's voice sang from the corner of the room, too faint to identify words. A woman's face appeared in the dark behind my eyelids, her mouth opening wider than any jaw could stretch. I woke gasping, clutching the lantern like a lifeline. Sleep became fragmented, shallow. I feared the night because of the things outside. I feared the day because of what haunted my dreams. The journal on the shelf drew me back, despite my earlier vow. I turned to the black ink pages, holding them to the lantern light, searching for words hidden beneath the obliteration. A few letters emerged, faint beneath the swaths of ink: binding, blood, succession. That last word cut deepest. Had my uncle chosen me deliberately? Did he know that inheriting the cabin meant inheriting the burden? One entry had escaped the ink. Written in a trembling hand near the end, it read, "They only knock when the threshold weakens. If they learn your voice, the door will open from their side." The realization chilled me. When the imitation of my uncle spoke my name, it was not merely torment. It was practice, memorization. They were learning how to speak as me. The following nights confirmed it. The knocks returned, and now the voice was not my uncle's but my own. I heard my tone, my rhythm, calling from the porch, "Let me in. I forgot the key. Please. I'm cold. Don't you trust me?" I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound vibrated in the walls themselves. It is a singular kind of terror to hear your own voice outside a locked door, pleading to be allowed inside. I stopped sleeping. Days blurred into feverish stretches of wakefulness, my mind unraveling at the edges. Once, while splitting logs, I noticed movement in the clearing. I looked up to see myself standing at the edge of the trees. Not an echo or shadow, but a perfect replica waving slowly. The rules forbade returning the gesture. My double's arm remained raised for hours, until twilight erased it into mist. Desperation drove me to the trapdoor I had avoided. I pried it open and descended with the lantern, each step groaning beneath my weight. The cellar was shallow, no larger than the cabin itself, walls lined with shelves of jars. But these jars did not hold mushrooms or roots. Inside floated things that looked like small animals stripped of skin, pale eyes clouded, mouths frozen mid-snarl. The smell was unbearable, copper and rot. In the center of the cellar stood a circle of stones, etched with markings I did not recognize. On the circle's edge rested a loaf of stale bread, mold climbing its crust. My uncle had been feeding them not just at the stump, but here as well. Perhaps this was the circle he warned me about in the dream. I backed away, but something shifted in the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. A scrape, then a whisper. Not words, but the sound of breath sliding across teeth. I fled up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut, piling heavy furniture atop it. The air of the cabin felt safer than that cellar, though safety was always an illusion here. The next morning, I woke to find the bread already gone from the stump. I had not placed it there yet. Panic surged through me. I had broken the schedule. Yet when I checked the table inside, a fresh slice waited, buttered neatly, though I had no butter in the cabin. The rules were shifting. From that day, every offering I placed was altered when I returned. Sliced in patterns, smeared with ash, once even bitten as though a child had taken a single mouthful. I stopped eating altogether, too afraid of tainted food, surviving on water boiled from the stream. My body weakened, my thoughts frayed, and still the forest pressed closer. One dusk, the wind died abruptly. I remembered the rule. Go inside, bolt the shutters, wait for bird song. I obeyed, heart racing, lantern burning. Hours passed without sound. Then came a creaking like branches bending under weight, but it came from the roof. I knew what followed: scratching, circling, dragging. But this time, something heavier descended, shaking dust from the beams. A thud landed above my bed. The wood groaned under mass too great for shingles to bear. I lay frozen until a pale hand pressed through a gap in the ceiling, fingers long enough to brush the floor. I screamed, lighting the lantern higher. The hand recoiled, leaving gouges in the wood. Silence swallowed the cabin again. When dawn came, I found the roof unmarked. The only evidence was the dirt under my fingernails, packed deep as though I had clawed the floor in sleep. The journal whispered a final revelation. In the margin of the last page, faint pencil lines read, "There is no inheritance. There is only succession. When one fails, another must replace them, or the door opens. Blood binds the post. Blood seals it shut." I stared at those words until my vision blurred. If the cabin was a prison for whatever lurked in the forest, then my uncle had been its warden. His death had passed the role to me. My duty was not ownership, but containment. That night, I heard not knocking but laughter outside, dozens of voices woven together. My uncle's, mine, strangers. They circled the cabin, taunting, tempting. And though I stayed inside, lantern blazing, lock secure, I felt the truth sink in. They were waiting for me to fail, because eventually, inevitably, every warden breaks. The laughter outside dwindled with the sunrise, but its echo lingered in my skull long after the birds returned. I staggered through the morning, clutching at fragments of sanity, until the weight of exhaustion forced me to sit at the table. The journal still lay open where I had left it, the words about succession etched into my mind. Blood binds the post. Blood seals it shut. My uncle had chosen me, or perhaps the cabin itself had chosen me. But either way, I could not escape the duty. The realization pressed against my chest like a vice. My life was no longer mine. I began to measure time not in days but in offering. Each morning became a ritual of carrying the bread, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the tree line. The stump looked different now. Its surface, once rough with age, had worn smooth, as though countless hands had pressed against it. I wondered how many caretakers had stood where I stood, repeating the same motions, feeding something that demanded endless attention. It was on the 7th week that I noticed the bread no longer disappeared cleanly. When I returned, fragments remain, crusts scattered, crumbs arranged in shapes too deliberate to be chance. A spiral one day, a cross the next, then a crude outline of a hand with 6 fingers. I began sketching them in the margins of the journal, trying to discern a pattern. But no matter how I analyzed them, they looked less like symbols and more like taunts, as though reminding me they could reach into my world whenever they pleased. The voices grew bolder at night. no longer confined to knocks and whispers. They conversed just beyond the shutters, imitating hunters, hikers, neighbors I had never met. I heard a woman laugh softly, then a child ask for help, then my own voice curse at me. Once, they recited the rules aloud in a chorus, each voice carrying a different inflection. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound vibrated in the floorboards, in the walls, in my teeth. The trapdoor weighed on me like a secret. I had barricaded it, yet I dreamed of descending again. In my dreams, the jars were broken, their contents gone, and the circle of stones glowed faintly with embers. A figure, sometimes my uncle, sometimes myself, stood in the center, whispering words I could not hear. When I woke, sweat drenched me, and the cabin smelled faintly of smoke though no fire had burned. Food dwindled. My supplies shrank with every passing week. I ate less, drank more water, but hunger gnawed at me until I felt hollow. Once, in desperation, I tore a piece from the offering loaf before carrying the rest to the stump. The bread tasted bitter, almost metallic, but I swallowed it anyway. That night, my stomach writhed, and I vomited black sludge into the dirt outside. When I looked again at the loaf on the stump the next morning, it was whole, untouched, as though mocking my theft. I added another line to the rules: do not eat what is theirs. The forest began to shift around me. Paths I had cleared grew over overnight. Fallen branches arranged themselves in patterns, arrows pointing toward the cabin. Trees leaned subtly inward, branches arching like ribs forming a cage. Even the animals changed. A hare sat in the clearing one afternoon, unmoving, its eyes wide and glassy. When I approached, it did not flee. Instead, it opened its mouth, and the sound of my uncle's laugh spilled out. I crushed it beneath the axe before I realized what I was doing, then buried it deep in the soil, though I doubted burial would mean anything here. Sleep deprivation carved hollows beneath my eyes. My reflection in the lantern glass looked more like the figure I had seen at the tree line than myself. Some nights I caught myself murmuring the rules aloud as I drifted toward unconsciousness, as though repetition alone could keep the barriers intact. I feared that if I forgot even one line, I would invite disaster. It was during one of those bleary nights that I realized a new rule had appeared. The list on my uncle's paper looked unchanged at first, but when I traced the numbers with my finger, there was an eighth: do not answer the phone after midnight. I stared, heart pounding. There had never been a phone in the cabin. I tore through every drawer, every shelf, until I found an old rotary phone beneath the bed, caked with dust. Its cord ended abruptly, severed, not attached to any wall socket. I wanted to throw it into the fire, but dread stopped me. If the rules said it must not be answered, then destroying it might be just as dangerous. For several nights, nothing happened. Then one evening, as I lay staring at the ceiling beams, the phone rang. The sound was piercing, shrill, impossible for a severed cord. My body seized with fear. It rang 3 times, paused, then 3 more. Exactly like the knocks. I pressed the pillow over my head, but the sound drilled through. After the 9th ring, it stopped. Silence returned, but my hands shook for hours. The following night, it rang again. This time, 10 times in a row before halting. I never touched it. Yet in the morning, I found the receiver lifted, dangling slightly off the hook. I replaced it carefully, lips pressed tight. My uncle's handwriting seemed to shimmer in my mind. Do not answer. The air inside the cabin grew suffocating. I opened the shutters one day to let in light, but what lay outside was not the clearing. Instead, I saw a reflection of the cabin itself, as though a mirror hung where the forest should be. The mirrored cabin looked older, rotting, its shutters hanging loose, its roof caved in. For a heartbeat, I saw a figure at its window, me, gaunt and pale, staring back. I slammed the shutters shut and collapsed against the wall, heart hammering. I no longer trusted my senses. Days and nights twisted together, bread offerings blending with dreams, voices bleeding into waking thought. The rules remained my anchor, yet they felt less like protection and more like shackles. My uncle had obeyed them until his death. Would I share the same end, bound forever, leaving the burden to some unsuspecting heir? It was the phone that broke me. On the 12th night it rang, louder than before. So loud the lantern glass trembled. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound burrowed into my skull. On the 13th ring, it stopped. Then a voice whispered from the receiver, though I had not touched it. It said, My voice. You're tired. You don't need to fight anymore. Just answer. The phone clicked once, then silence. I stared at the black rotary, and in that silence I understood the rules were not infinite. They were escalating, testing, bending until something must break. And when it did, the door would open, just as the journal warned. That night, I did not sleep. I sat by the lantern, list in hand, whispering the rules again and again, afraid that forgetting one syllable would undo me. Outside, the forest shifted, alive with shapes pressing against the edge of the clearing. Waiting, the laughter returned, but now it was layered with a deeper sound, something like breathing, slow and immense, as though the earth itself inhaled. I wondered then if my uncle had heard it, too, at the end. If he had sat where I sat, repeating the rules until his voice broke, listening to the forest breathe around him. If his final act was not death but surrender. When dawn came, I went to the stump. For the first time, I found no trace of the bread. Not eaten, not moved, simply gone, as if it had never been placed. The soil around the stump pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. I dropped to my knees, gripping the edges of the stump, and whispered, "What do you want from me?" The forest answered with silence. But silence, I had learned, was never empty. The silence after my whispered plea was worse than laughter, worse than the knocks. It pressed into my ears until they rang, and in that hollow ringing I sensed an answer. Not in words, but in the absence of them. The forest wanted me hollow. It wanted me emptied of thought, of will, of resistance. Bread was only the beginning, the true offering was myself. I stumbled back to the cabin, clinging to the rules as though they were rope lines in a blizzard. Always lock the door. Do not whistle. Wait for birdsong. Never fish after midnight. Do not wave. Feed them brave. Do not answer the phone. Yet each line felt brittle now, already bent to breaking. That evening, I lit the lantern earlier than usual, afraid of shadows stretching long before sunset. The glow flickered across the walls, illuminating cracks in the wood I hadn't noticed before. My uncle's presence clung to every beam, every knot in the timber, as though he watched from within the structure itself. For the first time, I wondered if he had truly died. Maybe he had only been absorbed into the post, dissolved like sugar in dark water, his consciousness stretched thin to keep the threshold closed. As night deepened, the voices returned. They called less like tormentors now and more like companions, coaxing, promising. You don't have to be alone. The rules are chains. Daniel, come outside. Just a moment. I pressed my back to the wall, covering my ears, but one voice cut through the others, my mother's. She had died when I was 15. Yet I heard her clearly, calling my name the way she did when dinner was ready. I nearly opened the door before catching myself, shaking violently. The rules said nothing about familiar voices, but I knew instinctively that answering them would unravel me. Near midnight, the phone rang again. Its shrill tone filled the cabin like smoke suffocating. I glared at it, fury rising. If I was to be trapped here, if every night was to be a siege, then I wanted answers. The rules forbade me to answer, but what was left to lose? I stood over the phone, hand trembling above the receiver. It rang a final time, then clicked, silent. The stillness afterward felt like mockery. I sank into the chair, head in my hands, whispering apologies to my uncle, to myself, to whatever heard. Sleep came in fractured bursts. When I dreamed, I found myself walking through the cellar. The jars were shattered, their contents gone. The circle of stones glowed faintly red. In its center stood my uncle, skin stretched thin across his bones, eyes black pits. He held out the list of rules, but when I reached for it, the paper crumbled into ash. His voice rasped. "You can't hold it forever. The post breaks. The door opens. Choose the manner of your end." I woke to daylight, heart hammering, bile burning my throat. Outside, the stump no longer pulsed but split. A crack had opened down its center, black soil spilling like blood. The bread I placed slid into that fissure on its own, swallowed whole. The balance was failing. That afternoon, I tried once more to leave. I walked the road, refusing to turn back, forcing my eyes forward. The forest shifted around me, trunks bending, path folding. Yet for one brief moment I glimpsed open sky beyond the trees. I ran, lungs tearing, until I stumbled into another clearing, not the cabins, but one stranger. In its center stood another cabin, identical in design, but older, more rotted. Its windows were hollow, its door ajar. I stepped closer. Inside, dust coated every surface. The lantern on the table was shattered. The bed collapsed, the shelves bare. But the rules were there, pinned to the wall. They were nearly the same, though the handwriting differed. The first line read, "Always close the gate after dark." The rest diverged further, instructions about salt, about nails, about songs I had never heard. Another caretaker's rules, another post. I fled, stumbling blindly, until the forest folded again and delivered me to my own clearing. My own cabin waiting with its closed shutters. The message was clear: there were more posts, more prisons, scattered through these woods. Others had stood where I stood, each with their own rules, each bound to hold the line. My uncle had not been alone. I was not alone, and yet the knowledge brought no comfort, only despair. Because if there were many prisons, then what they contained was vast, endless. That night, the scratching on the roof returned, heavier than before. Dust fell in streams, beams groaning. I lit the lantern, clutching the rules, whispering them aloud. But the scratching did not stop. It grew louder, frantic, until something tore through the shingles. A pale arm thrust downward, fingers too long, nails scraping sparks from the floorboards. I screamed, hurling the lantern upward. Flames licked across the roof, the arm recoiling. The sound replaced by a chorus of shrieks outside. The fire caught quickly, too quickly. Smoke filled the cabin. I staggered out the door, choking, into the clearing. The forest ringed me, alive with figures. Dozens, maybe hundreds, swaying in unison, their faces pale blanks, their eyes hollow. They did not cross the clearing but pressed against its edge, as though bound. Behind them, deeper shadows moved, something larger breathing among the trunks. I turned back to the cabin. Flames devoured it, roof caving. The rules inside shriveled into ash. For a heartbeat, I felt free. No list, no burden, nothing to obey. But the figures swayed faster, voices rising. They had been held at bay by those walls, by those words. Without them, nothing remained to contain. In desperation, I stumbled to the stump. The crack in its surface had widened, soil splitting open into a dark pit. Heat rose from within, carrying the smell of iron and rot. I dropped to my knees and screamed into the fissure, "What do you want from me?" The answer came not in words but in movement. The soil surged upward, wrapping my wrists, pulling me toward the pit. My own reflection surfaced in the blackness. Gaunt, hollow, grinning. The forest roared with laughter. I tore free, bleeding from the wrists, and stumbled back. The stump pulsed against sealing its crack, though the pit still smoldered beneath. The figures retreated, slowly melting into the trees. The fire of the cabin died down too quickly for natural flame, leaving only blackened timbers. I understood then the cabin could not be destroyed. It would rebuild, as it had for my uncle, as it had for caretakers before me. The rules would return, perhaps rewritten, perhaps new. The cycle was unbroken. That night, I slept in the ashes. When I woke, the cabin stood whole again, lantern gleaming faintly inside, rules pinned neatly to the table. My uncle's handwriting waited for me, but the list had grown. 10 rules now. The new one chilled me to the marrow. When the time comes, you must choose your successor.